Welcome to Sleepy Case Files, a place where quiet storytelling meets mysterious cases. Tonight, we slowly explore a story from the world of true crime.
Atlanta, Georgia, in the spring of 1913, was a city caught in a profound cultural transition. It was a metropolis striving to become the industrial heart of the American South, moving away from an agrarian past and embracing rapid urbanization. The population expanded dramatically, bringing new societal pressures. Underneath this veneer of modern progress, the deep-seated cultural anxieties of the post-Reconstruction era remained present. The city was a volatile melting pot of displaced rural farmers, newly arrived immigrants looking for opportunity, and northern industrialists who brought necessary capital but were viewed with suspicion by the local populace. This environment created an atmosphere ripe for intense class tension, racial animosity, and xenophobia. It was within this pressurized societal powder keg that one of the most divisive criminal cases in American history would ignite. Saturday, April the 26th, 1913 was Confederate Memorial Day. The city of Atlanta was in a distinctly festive and nostalgic mood, with parades scheduled to honor fallen veterans and many local businesses operating on shortened hours. Among the citizens navigating the downtown streets was Mary Fagan, a 13-year-old girl who worked on the assembly line at the National Pencil Company factory. Like many children of impoverished rural families who had relocated to the urban center for reliable work, she spent her days doing monotonous labor for exceptionally meager wages. On this Saturday, the factory floor was mostly quiet and closed for the holiday, but she traveled downtown specifically to collect her accumulated pay from the previous work week, which amounted to exactly $1.20. She arrived at the factory shortly after 12 p.m., intending to quickly collect her wages from the superintendent's office and then join the parade outside. She would never be seen alive again. The National Pencil Company building, located on Forsyth Street, was a sprawling, multi-story brick structure filled with heavy machinery, raw materials, and dark corners. At roughly 3 a.m. on Sunday, April the 27th, 1913, the factory night watchman, Newt Lee, was making his routine security rounds through the deserted building. He descended into the cavernous basement, a space primarily used for bulk storage and housing the large boiler and incinerator. In the flickering light of his lantern, he discovered a tragic scene that would forever alter the history of the city. Near the metal incinerator, covered in dark dirt and wooden factory shavings, lay the lifeless body of the 13-year-old girl. The physical evidence at the immediate scene indicated a struggle in the dark, obscured by the heavy layer of coal dust covering the floor. The fatal cause of death was determined to be asphyxiation. The specific details of the trauma will not be excessively described. However, it is essential to state that her clothing was torn and her face was heavily soiled with the thick soot characteristic of the basement floor. The physical evidence strongly suggested an attack followed by her being dragged a significant distance across the rough floor to her final resting place near the incinerator. Crucially, investigators found 2 hastily scribbled notes lying adjacent to the victim. These messages, written on order pads utilizing carbon paper from the front office, were written in an exaggerated dialect. The two notes explicitly and repetitively blamed a tall black man for the crime. This was a clumsy attempt to direct the police toward a specific demographic and away from the true perpetrator. The discovery of these notes immediately complicated the investigation, introducing a layer of intentional misdirection. The Atlanta police force, pressured by an outraged public and a sensationalist local press demanding swift answers for such a heinous act, initially arrested Newt Lee as the man who discovered the scene, and as an African American in the segregated South, he was the most obvious, convenient target for a quick resolution. However, police detectives soon realized that the timeline of his shift simply did not align with the medical examiner's estimated time of death. Furthermore, his genuinely cooperative demeanor during initial interrogations did not suggest the guilt or evasiveness of a panicked perpetrator. As the investigation necessarily expanded beyond the night watchman, the focus of the Atlanta Police Department began to shift toward the last person definitively known to have seen the victim alive, the superintendent of the National Pencil Company, Leo Frank. Leo Frank was a 29-year-old Cornell University graduate who had relocated from Brooklyn, New York to Atlanta to manage the pencil factory, an enterprise backed by his wealthy uncle. He was a stark outsider in almost every sense that mattered to the social hierarchy of 1913 Atlanta. He was a northern intellectual, an industrialist manager representing the perceived capitalist exploitation of vulnerable southern labor, and importantly, he was Jewish. In an environment already fraught with xenophobia and rural resentment toward urban wealth, he quickly became a convenient target for the city's collective cultural anxieties. When police detectives arrived at his comfortable home early on the morning of Sunday, April the 27th, 1913, to bring him down to the factory to identify the body, they noted that he appeared exceptionally nervous and agitated. He was visibly trembling, unusually pale, and initially gave conflicting answers about the exact times he had arrived at and departed from the factory the previous day. The police, interpreting this visible anxiety as a definitive sign of guilt rather than the natural shock of a sheltered corporate manager confronted with a crime in his own facility, immediately began to build a circumstantial case against him. The investigative methods of the early 20th century were largely devoid of modern forensic science. There was no capability for advanced genetic testing or sophisticated crime scene reconstruction. Blood typing was in its absolute infancy. Instead, detectives relied almost entirely on witness testimony, circumstantial behavioral evidence, and the aggressive extraction of confessions. The police desperately needed a cohesive, plausible narrative that could physically place the 29-year-old superintendent in the basement with the victim, and they soon found the architect of that narrative in the form of the factory sweep. This development would completely shift the trajectory of the investigation, providing the state with the star witness they required. Several days after the incident, police discovered Jim Conley, a janitor who worked at the factory, attempting to wash a heavily soiled shirt. He was known to have been at the factory on the day of the crime, allegedly hiding in the shadows of the dark first floor to avoid aggressive debt collectors who were pursuing him for unpaid loans. When initially brought in for questioning by the detectives, he completely denied any knowledge of the event or the victim. However, over the course of several intense weeks and unrelenting police interrogation, his story evolved dramatically. Through a series of formal sworn affidavits, his narrative shifted from complete ignorance to minor involvement and finally to being an eyewitness to the aftermath of the crime. Each new iteration of his story added fresh layers of direct implication against the 29-year-old superintendent. The final narrative that he eventually settled upon, and the exact one the prosecution would eagerly adopt for their case, was complex and highly incriminating. He claimed that the superintendent was a habitual philanderer who routinely used his private office on Saturdays for illicit encounters. According to the ultimate affidavit, the superintendent had propositioned the young girl immediately after paying her the $1.20. When she refused his advances, he violently attacked her, resulting in her death. The janitor then claimed that the superintendent, in a state of sheer panic, summoned him to the second floor office. He testified that he found his boss trembling, violently staring blankly at the floor. He claimed that the superintendent confessed to the crime on the spot, explicitly ordering his subordinate to help him dispose of the evidence to avoid detection. The detailed story described how the two men worked together to conceal the crime. The janitor claimed they wrapped the body in a piece of heavy cloth, loaded it onto the factory mechanical elevator, and descended together to the basement. There, the janitor claimed, the superintendent specifically directed him to write the two notes found at the scene, dictating the exact words in a calculated attempt to frame another night watchman or a random intruder. The police and the prosecution chose to completely accept this final narrative. They proceeded with this theory despite its glaring contradictions with his earlier sworn statements, and more importantly, despite clear conflicts with the physical evidence of the building itself. The state had secured its primary narrative, setting the stage for a trial that would captivate the entire nation. The trial officially commenced in August of 1913 and almost immediately degenerated into a terrifying spectacle of mob intimidation and overt prejudice. The courthouse was sweltering in the brutal late summer heat, and the atmosphere was described by visiting national reporters as resembling a deeply hostile arena rather than a court of law. Enormous crowds of angry, highly agitated citizens surrounded the building daily, frequently cheering the prosecution's maneuvers and aggressively jeering the defense attorneys as they entered and exited. Because of the heat, courtroom windows were left open, allowing the explicit threats of the mob outside to reach the ears of the judge, the witnesses, and the 12 men of the jury. This pervasive atmosphere of intimidation made a fair and impartial hearing functionally impossible. The prosecution team, led by an ambitious Solicitor General, relied almost entirely on the janitor's testimony. In response, the defense desperately attempted to present a more logical alternative narrative, meticulously avoiding fragmented lists of possibilities in favor of a cohesive story. This narrative proposed that the janitor, who freely admitted to being heavily intoxicated and in desperate need of money that Saturday, encountered the young girl on the dimly lit first floor shortly after she left the office, seeking to rob her of her freshly collected $1.20 to satisfy his debts. He attacked her in the shadows. Realizing the severity of his actions, he then dragged her body down to the basement alone. He subsequently forged the 2 notes to deflect police suspicion away from himself. Despite the logical consistency of the defense's narrative, the hostile courtroom atmosphere rendered it completely ineffective. Furthermore, the defense strategy backfired drastically in the deeply racially charged environment of 1913 Georgia. Many white jurors and local observers found it completely inconceivable that an uneducated laborer could possess the mental cunning to frame a wealthy, educated manager so effectively. The underlying current of severe anti-Semitism permeated every single aspect of the judicial proceedings, coloring the perception of all presented evidence. After an exhaustive 30-day trial, the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a unanimous verdict of guilty. The presiding judge, sensing the extreme physical danger of a violent riot if the defendant were present in the courtroom, took the highly unusual step of advising the defense team and the defendant to remain secured in their jail cells during the public reading of the verdict. The following day, the judge formally sentenced the 29-year-old defendant to death. The guilty verdict immediately sparked a prolonged and incredibly complex legal battle that captured national attention. The case painstakingly worked its way through the appellate system, eventually reaching the Supreme Court of the United States. While the court ultimately denied the final appeal in 1915, 2 prominent justices formally dissented, explicitly noting the severe irregularities and the overwhelming influence of the hostile mob. As the scheduled execution date rapidly approached, the final hope for justice rested entirely with the governor of Georgia. Faced with an agonizing political and moral decision, he chose to undertake an exhaustive personal review of the case file, spanning over 10,000 pages of documents. During his inspection, he found glaring, undeniable impossibilities in the timeline. Crucially, he noted that if the 2 men had actually used the elevator to transport the body, it would have crushed debris at the very bottom of the shaft, which police investigators had specifically noted was completely undisturbed on the morning of April the 27th, 1913. Convinced beyond a shadow of a doubt that a fundamentally fair trial had not occurred, the governor made a deeply courageous but politically disastrous maneuver. On June 21st, 1915, he officially commuted the sentence from death to life imprisonment. The public reaction across Georgia was immediate and explosive. Mobs numbering in the thousands marched aggressively on the governor's mansion, eventually forcing him to flee the state under armed guard. The prisoner, meanwhile, had been secretly transferred to a heavily fortified state penitentiary in Milledgeville for his own protection. The commutation did not quell the public rage. It merely redirected it toward calculated vigilante action. In the town of Marietta, a group of prominent local citizens convened in secret on the night of August 16, 1915. A convoy of vehicles carrying exactly 25 heavily armed men traveled over 100 miles to the prison farm. Operating with precision, they cut the telephone wires, overpowered the guards, and forcibly removed the prisoner. On the morning of August 17, 1915, in a quiet grove of trees, the mob summarily hanged him. For over 60 years, the official legal record of the state remained entirely unchanged. However, in 1982, a startling historical revelation emerged that fundamentally altered the understanding of the case. Alonzo Mann, who had been a 14-year-old office boy working at the factory in 1913, finally came forward with a terrible secret he had kept hidden for nearly 70 years. He officially swore in a legal affidavit that on the day of the crime, he had walked into the first floor of the factory and clearly seen the janitor carrying the lifeless body of the young girl entirely alone. He explicitly stated that the man had immediately threatened to kill him if he ever spoke a word about what he had witnessed. Terrified by the threat, the young boy remained silent throughout the entire investigation and trial. Based directly on this undeniable testimony, the Georgia State Board of Pardons and Paroles finally issued a posthumous pardon in 1986, officially acknowledging that the state had failed to protect the defendant and had denied him a fair trial.